everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here. Awesome. So welcome to Psychedelic Speakers Volume 2. My name is Bruce. It's my honor to be here and to introduce to you Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris, who will be speaking tonight on the following topic: can magic mushrooms be used to treat depression? So at this time, I would ask that everybody turn off your cell phones, beepers, mobile devices, tablets, anything that could cause any sort of sonic disturbance during the presentation. We ask that you turn it off or silent it at least, please. Before we get started, I would just like to also draw your attention to the Psychedelic Research Petition. I know many of you in the room may already know about the petition, but for those of you who don't know about it or who haven't already signed, we do have a petition going to the Government of Canada and to the House of Commons right now for psychedelic research to be funded in Canadian universities and research facilities in Canada. Thanks, guys. So many, many eons ago, Canada was a world leader in psychedelic research. In recent years, such has not been the case. Times change, but we believe that times can change again. You'll see tonight in the research that Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris presents that there are far-reaching implications that can affect positive change in the world of mental health and a variety of other fields in terms of understanding the mind and understanding what these substances can do. So if you haven't already done so, please take a look at the petition. You can visit at the website below. It takes about 15 seconds to sign, and you become part of something that, we can really make a difference here. So, next. We're psychedelic speakers. You're here in the room in Toronto at the George Ignatieff Theatre at the U of T. And this local event was brought to you by the Toronto Psychedelic Society and the Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy, two groups that are very committed to educating everybody about the profound implications of these substances. But we're two groups in one city. So Psychedelic Speakers is actually bringing together multiple cities at one time. So if you'll just give me a second. We have 7 different cities with us tonight. We have Montreal. Can Montreal wave? Can you guys hear me? Can you wave? Or are they might be a little blanked out here. Where are they? Oh, here he is. Okay, we got a wave from Montreal. We have Charleston. Charleston. There they are. Awesome. Atlanta. You got Atlanta on there? Cool, yeah, sorry, Atlanta, there they are. Baltimore. Oh, Baltimore, okay. Baltimore, you're with us in our hearts. We see you, okay. Columbus? How are we doing in Columbus? Can we see Columbus? Nobody Columbus. Corvallis, which is in Oregon. There they are, awesome. And Ottawa. Cool. Awesome. So, as you can see, this is a community far beyond just this room. And sorry, I'm just going to bring this back here. Oh, of course. Sorry, Toronto. How could I forget you guys? Everybody wave. Okay, awesome. So as you can see, it's a community far beyond this room, and that's what we're trying to do here. We're just trying to get the word out, and thank you for participating and being part of that today. So without further ado, I'm just going to get to, I think, the moment you've all been waiting for, to introduce to you our guest of honor, Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris. He's a psychiatrist, neuroscientist, and the head of psychedelic research at the Center for Neuropsychopharmacology at the London. He is a world leader in the study of the human psychedelic state, and he's also a world leader in the neuroimaging of said state, which is really fascinating, and he'll be able to show you some of the great findings of his research and some of the real empirical data, which is super exciting for us. He's also recently done some clinical trials with psilocybin in subjects with treatment-resistant depression. So he's going to share some of the findings of all this today, and without further ado, please give a warm Toronto and international welcome to Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris.
Thanks.
Slideshow here.
Well, wow. quite a surreal experience to be in 7 cities at the same time.
Well, what did I do?
But no, there's something quite special going on at the moment, isn't there? And it feels such a privilege to just be part of it as much as anything. It's often, I feel, important to reflect on, just how lucky one is to be able to do this research and contribute to the furthering of our understanding of these fascinating compounds. So what I want to do with this talk, really, first of all, am I standing in the right place? I know you guys were quite particular about where I should be, but yeah, good. All right, we're good. No, I'll cover quite a range of different topics. We'll start with the molecular and then move into some of the human brain imaging work that I've been doing before moving on to some of the work around the therapeutic application of psychedelics generally, showing you some of the data from my recent clinical trial with psilocybin in depression. And then end with some kind of philosophical, maybe political considerations. Great, thank you. No. And how do I move the slides here?
I think just use those keys.
Okay.
If you just
right. Yeah, they don't see. Oh, okay, cool.
Just arrow key to the right.
Yeah. Yeah, great. So yes, and let's start with some basics. What are classic psychedelic drugs? Well, the term has its origin psychedelic in 1957 and emerged through a conversation between these two individuals, Humphrey Osmond, working in Canada with LSD, looking specifically at LSD as a treatment for alcohol dependence. And Humphrey Osmond was the individual who turned Aldous Huxley onto psychedelics. He supplied him with some mescaline, which formed the basis of Huxley's experience, which he wrote about famously in The Doors of Perception. And it was really these individuals who were looking for a term that could more aptly capture what it is about these compounds that's so interesting. And what is it that's fundamental to what they do to the mind? They felt that the available terms at the time, hallucinogens, referring to the perceptual changes that can be induced by these drugs, and also psychotomimetic, that these compounds can mimic certain aspects of psychosis, just really referred to particular aspects of the phenomenology of the psychedelic experience, and perhaps not the essential aspect of what these compounds do. And so together they wanted to find a term that would refer to the principle that psychedelics reveal more of our minds that is normally available to our conscious awareness. And so between the two of them, they kind of exchanged little rhymes and different neologisms, terms that they were inventing to refer to these compounds. Huxley came up with phanrothyme and this little rhyme: to make the mundane world sublime, take half a gram of phanrothyme. Yeah, half a gram of mescaline, but perhaps not other psychedelics. Osmond, in exchange, came up with this term: to fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic, and thus the term was coined. And both of these terms are referring to essentially the same thing. Phanrothyme, I think its Greek origin is spirit, making the spirit manifest. A psychedelic is most strictly the soul, revealing the soul, or perhaps revealing the mind. And I think it's fortunate that this term has stuck, because my own view is that it is indeed what these compounds are doing. And it's this that makes them so interesting and likely accounts for why they have such remarkable therapeutic potential, that they reveal more of our minds than is normally available to us. And in terms of examples of classic psychedelic drugs, psilocybin, the prodrug of psilocin, both compounds found in magic mushrooms, which grow throughout the world. DMT, dimethyltryptamine, found throughout the natural world, including in our own bodies in very small amounts. And also the major psychedelic ingredient in ayahuasca, the Amazonian brew. LSD, the prototypical psychedelic, it was only after LSD came on the scene that the term psychedelic was coined, and there was this major wave of scientific interest in these compounds, really starting in the 1950s, going into the 60s, and unfortunately ending more or less around the late 60s. And what's curious when we look at the molecular structure of these compounds, psilocin here, dimethyltryptamine here, very similar. LSD, a slightly more complex compound, and then the endogenous neurotransmitter serotonin is how similar, particularly with psilocin and DMT, the molecular structure of these compounds is to the naturally occurring neurotransmitter serotonin. And it hints at what they're doing in the brain, that they are mimicking the natural neurotransmitter serotonin that's involved in so many important psychological functions, from modulating consciousness, modulating mood, modulating sleep, modulating our thinking, our cognition. They're hijacking a particular aspect of the serotonin system and stimulating it, and it's that accounts for their remarkable effects. And what aspect of the serotonin system are these compounds hijacking? Well, it is a particular aspect. There are some 14 different serotonin receptors that all do slightly different things. They're expressed on neurons, and when they're stimulated, they'll modulate the behavior of the neurons. And this particular serotonin receptor, the serotonin 2A receptor, evidence suggests is key to how psychedelics work in the brain. And we know that because if we give a blocker, a compound that will selectively block this receptor, and then you give a psychedelic, essentially people won't trip, they won't have their experiences. And this is a relationship that seems to be specific to this particular receptor. We also know that the affinity of psychedelics for this particular receptor correlates very strongly with their potency. So affinity you can think of as stickiness perhaps, or binding potential. And so those psychedelics that are particularly sticky for this particular receptor, the serotonin 2A receptor, are the most potent. And to help illustrate that, we can think of LSD, which has a very high affinity for the serotonin 2A receptor, and it's remarkably potent. So you only need very small amounts of LSD to experience its characteristic psychological effects. What's also curious is where these 2A receptors are expressed, and this image you can see on the right-hand side is a PET image where these receptors have been labeled in the human brain. You can see that the expression is densest in the cortex, that aspect of our brains that is most evolutionarily expanded. Humans have much more cortex than other animals. And what's also curious is that the expression is highest in those aspects of the cortex that are also hierarchically at the highest level. They're associated with the highest level aspects of human consciousness or cognition. Functions like our ability to self-reflect, for example. So perhaps this is suggestive of what these compounds do psychologically, that they are modulating particularly high-level aspects of our consciousness. Also, in terms of basic mechanisms, if we think now about the therapeutic application of these compounds, a growing body of evidence is suggesting that the quality of the trip, if you want, or the psychedelic experience that people have is predictive of the longer-term therapeutic outcomes. And that's something I'll talk about increasingly as we go on. And this speaks to the principle that this is a particularly novel therapeutic paradigm, it's quite different to conventional treatments in psychiatry, and actually, there lies, in many respects, the real potential of this treatment, that it's really, truly something quite different, and perhaps something, long overdue in that respect. One of the aspects about this treatment model that makes it so different and potentially so powerful is that it's much more than just a drug treatment. It's a treatment that depends very much on the context in which the drug experience plays out, that the environment is very critical to the experience and the longer term outcomes, and also where the individual is, how's the sound there, where the individual is in terms of their own particular psychology. Now this model, this chart at the bottom here, I present because it helps potentially us understand what psychedelics are doing in relation to the major leading antidepressant medication in terms of, for example, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors working more on the stress circuitry in the brain to have a dampening effect on that stress circuitry, helping people cope better, but perhaps not really getting at the sort of root causes of people's suffering. Whereas if you compare that to what psychedelics are doing, they're working much more on the cortex, on higher level aspects of consciousness, creating a window of plasticity in which the context, the environment becomes increasingly important, and there is a window of opportunity for change, fundamental change, transformative change. So this window of opportunity for people to change out of their state. Now this slide here I present really just to get it all down in terms of the growing evidence base for the psychedelic treatment model. So I won't go through it in detail, but I have reviewed it in this paper with Guy Goodwin. You can see the reference at the top. And in the box here, I summarize the recent clinical trials. You'll see that they've looked at a range of different disorders: obsessive compulsive disorder, end-of-life distress, alcohol dependence, tobacco addiction, major depression, treatment-resistant depression. And if we distill this down to some key principles, there are some things that we can conclude really from this work. And that is that the treatment, with important caveats really around the importance of the setting, around the context, the treatment appears to be safe. Gosh, funny timing as well. Yeah, it seems to be safe in terms of, the kind of specters that may, at least in the past, have hung over psychedelics, ideas that they might send people crazy, that they might have flashbacks and such like. This is emerging from our research and other research teams. And so, done in the right way, in a controlled way, the treatment can be delivered quite safely and is quite well tolerated. The effect sizes appear to be large. You'll see some of them in our recent trial, but other teams have also been finding the same thing. So the magnitude of for example, decreases in depression are of a large extent relative to other treatments that are available. And this curious finding that psychedelics appear to have a general therapeutic action, and this challenges the notion of kind of precision medicine in psychiatry, this idea that you can find a particular target associated with a quite distinct disorder, and then you can go in with your magic bullet drug and correct that abnormality and solve an issue. That kind of wishful notion doesn't seem to be the reality, at least in my view, and in many others in psychiatry. And psychedelics kind of speak to that idea again, that perhaps actually there's something that's quite common about mental illnesses and different psychiatric disorders, and actually they're more similar to each other in many respects than they are different, and maybe there are some key factors that underlie a range of different psychiatric disorders, and they're just different expressions or perhaps something more common that relates to them all. And perhaps psychedelics as a treatment model target those core factors, and that's how they can have this general therapeutic action. Also, that the effects appear to be rapid. In terms of our own trial, we saw drops in depression occurring pretty much instantaneously, at least after people had come down, and then the next day they were often feeling kind of lighter, they would describe. And remarkably, after just 1 or 2 treatments, the effects also appear to be enduring. Weeks, months, maybe even longer after these isolated experiences, people are still reporting benefits. So a lot of these things are really, challenging current assumptions in psychiatry. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that there is real potential here for a kind of revolution in mental health care, and also in psychology more generally, just understanding ourselves. But if we move forward and think about some of the brain imaging work that can help us understand the psychedelic experience, and perhaps also help us understand the therapeutic mechanisms associated with psychedelics. To do this, I want to really focus on a couple of principles rather than too much the details, really, with specific studies. And one of the key principles I want to talk about is this notion of dissolution or disintegration, the breaking apart of systems and the loss of integrity within systems. This is something that we've seen now repeatedly with different psychedelics and different brain imaging modalities. A particular finding that has attracted quite a bit of interest is the finding that a particular system in the brain called the default mode network that evidence suggests is arguably the strongest candidate for our sense of self, or perhaps our sense of ego, who we are, our persona, appears to be affected by psychedelics, and the magnitude of the effect in the change of organization of this particular network correlates very strongly with people's ratings of ego dissolution, so supporting that association between this particular network and our sense of self or our ego. Here we're seeing it with LSD, seeing a particular circuit which is part of the default mode network, it being less stable under LSD, and then the magnitude of that effect correlating very strongly with people's ratings of ego dissolution. And we've seen it also with psilocybin, here looking at the network in a slightly different way, looking at a particular rhythm in the brain that is especially pronounced in the human brain, the alpha rhythm. It's actually more pronounced in humans than other animals. It's more pronounced in adulthood than it is earlier on in life. And so, like the default mode network, it is something that we could associate with high-level consciousness, for example. And it's curious then that this particular rhythm, and also localized to the default mode network regions, if there's a collapse, as we see with psychedelics in this rhythm, in the default mode network regions, then that relates again to this experience of ego dissolution. So here essentially seeing the same thing, but with a different drug and a different imaging modality. Here again, this chart is looking at rhythms in the brain. The yellow band that you can see running across the chart is the alpha band. This is with DMT, these particular data. That red line is where we inject the DMT. You can see at baseline that the alpha rhythm is particularly prominent, as it is normally during normal waking consciousness. But as we inject the DMT in and people are shot into the highly bizarre DMT space, then that band essentially entirely disappears. And it mirrors very neatly the intensity of the experience. You can see that plotted in that dashed line. That's people's ratings of how intense the experience is. And we haven't shown the scale, but it's essentially peaking at 10 out of 10 for intensity. So, people were having some of these very bizarre experiences that people associate with DMT, such as encountering sentient beings that it seems like they hold a kind of special knowledge. And so these are some of the accounts of some of the participants in this particular study. One saying there are these sort of entities saying, have a look at this, have a look at this. There were shadows of presences taking care of me, moving at great speed around me and chanting. What we've also seen is that when we throw a measure of near-death experiences, a standard measure of near-death experiences, to these participants under the influence of DMT, people rate very strongly on those standard scales, as highly as you'll see when people have actual near-death experiences. So there may be some interesting overlaps there, not just in terms of the phenomenology, but also in terms of the brain physiology. So these are some examples really of changes in brain activity where a certain function that we ordinarily associate with normal waking consciousness is dropping away, so something's being lost. But are there some other examples where we can see a gain of a new order in the brain? And this particular finding relates to that. So here, instead of looking at the integrity of individual systems or networks, we're actually looking at how networks talk to each other. Will this pointer work? No. So these colors are different systems or networks, and at baseline you can see that most of the communication goes on within the networks. So there's a kind of insular kind of nature to the conversations, and then under psilocybin you can see that there's much freer crosstalk. There's actually an equal number of connections, believe it or not, in these two images, but what's changing is that the connections, the communication patterns are going on much more across systems rather than within the systems under the psychedelic. This is something that we've also seen with LSD. We've seen it correlating with people's ratings of ego dissolution. Something else that we've seen, which is quite curious, is that the positive flip side to ego dissolution in terms of the psychology of the experience is what has been variously described as a sense of oneness. It's been referred to as the unitive experience by Walter Stace, for example, a sense of interconnectedness. And it's curious that this may relate to this kind of desegregation that we're seeing in the brain, that if we look at the whole of the brain, there's much more global integrity in the brain. So although there's, if you want, a modular loss of integrity, if we step back and look at the whole of the brain, then it's behaving in a much more integrated way. That's correlating with ego dissolution, and going forward, maybe it correlates also with the unitive experience. Curiously, this could also be understood in relation to the development of brain organization, that as people develop ordinarily and mature from infancy into adulthood, the brain tends to undergo some distinct changes that are actually in the opposite direction to what we see with psychedelics. So networks become more integrated within themselves, and the brain also becomes more specialized or more segregated. And these are the processes that are occurring in reverse with psychedelics. So speaking to this notion of a kind of regression, going back maybe is the term phylogenetic? I often get mixed up with these, but within our own development, going back to an earlier phase, but maybe also evolutionarily going back to an earlier state of being in terms of the development of the human mind. Another thing that we can do to try and understand the action of psychedelics on the brain is to look at other states of consciousness, and by far the most research that's been done on altered states of consciousness has focused on states of reduced consciousness. So for example, with non-rapid eye movement sleep or dreamless sleep or deep sleep, or with the administration of different anesthetics. And when this has been done, and here this is a plot of the richness of brain activity or its diversity, what's seen is that in these states of reduced consciousness, activity becomes less rich, it becomes more predictable, it becomes simpler in some respects. Now, we threw this measure at psychedelics and found something quite curious. And to my knowledge, this hasn't been found with any other states of consciousness. So, you know, I always had a feeling that if we looked long enough at the brain with psychedelics, that we would be able to find something that would be special, you know, that would be truly anomalous, because the experience itself feels special and feels so unusual. Then, you know, it just stands to reason that we could find something in the brain in terms of changes in brain activity that would be special to someone who's never taken a psychedelic but knows the brain and sees a result like this and says, wow, you know. And so for me, this kind of thing is important in terms of, you know, communicating the value and the power of psychedelics, the scientific power of psychedelics to a broader audience, you know, people, not just people who know because they've taken psychedelics, but people who want to understand the brain and the mind. So this is something that we've seen with a range of different psychedelics, including the dissociative anesthetic, if you want, ketamine, which at the doses in which it was given does produce a kind of richness, an increase in the richness of conscious content. And that might be one way that we can think of this particular result, that if this measure of the complexity or diversity of brain activity will drop with drops in the level of consciousness, for example, with anesthetics, and we see it increasing with psychedelics, then maybe this is an index of the richness of conscious content, something that we can test more going forward. So the principle that psychedelics, if we turn our attention now more back onto their therapeutic potential, this key principle that this is very much more than just a drug, that certain personality traits that may have a genetic component to them, evidence suggests can be predictive of individuals' sensitivity to psychedelics. Also, the state that they're in before they take the psychedelic, for example, their readiness to surrender to the experience or let go, appears to be predictive of the quality of the experience that they'll have, and also the environment in which they have the experience. So, for example, the music. All these factors come in and shape the nature of someone's experience and subsequently the longer term outcomes as well. So this is a particularly complex treatment model, and that's just the way it is, you know. And the challenge is for us to better identify these variables, and in so doing, perhaps, you know, reduce some of the uncertainty that people have about what kind of trip, you know, what kind of experience an individual is going to have. And if we can do that, then we can make psychedelics safer and maybe also maximize their potential benefits. Another component that's worth thinking about is the cultural setting. You know, in this culture that we live in, psychedelics are illegal to use. They are highly stigmatized still, although perhaps that might be changing. And if we compare that to, for example, how psychedelics in their plant form are seen in other cultures where they've been used for maybe thousands of years as sacraments, as plant medicines for holistic healing, and these are plants that are revered and highly respected, then you can see how these different cultural approaches can influence then our expectations of what a psychedelic experience might be like, which will subsequently affect the kind of experience someone will have, which then feeds into the longer term outcomes that you'll see, which can then still feed into the cultural setting in a kind of loop like process. Just to sort of add a bit of detail to these principles and a bit of evidence, to support, for example, the importance of music in mediating the quality of the psychedelic experience. Here you can see on this chart that the people's relationship to the music that they listened to during the experience was predictive both of drops in depression and also whether they had a peak or mystical type experience, the kind of experience characterized by a sense of oneness or interconnectedness, for example. So music being critical and also having a peak experience being critical of the longer term outcomes. So in this chart, we split the sample into responders at 5 weeks after giving them psilocybin, and those who were responders scored significantly higher on these factors which relate to having a peak or mystical type experience, and actually they scored lower on anxiety as well. So here just endorsing that important principle that the quality of the experience is predictive of the longer term outcomes. Here's more data supporting that, instead of from our clinical trial, from a web-based survey where we tracked people as they intended to take a psychedelic. We measured them at baseline. We measured them just before they had the experience. We did this by asking them to complete a web-based survey, and if they were at a retreat, for example, to do it with a pen and paper, and then fill it in afterwards. And we see some of these factors that were predictive of the quality of the experience that they had, and then critically the quality of the experience that they have, predicting the longer term outcomes. Here we looked at well-being, and so the higher they scored on peak experience, the larger were the increases in well-being that they had. If they scored highly on having a challenging experience characterized by anxiety, dysphoria, then there was essentially a flattening of the changes in well-being. And some of these components here are worth mentioning, like a readiness to let go, to surrender to the experience, having a clear intention, having a therapeutic intention for the experience, being in a therapeutic setting, the higher the dose, curiously, all predictive of having a peak experience, and also some of these factors being protective against having a challenging experience, being ready, having a clear intention, also being in a trusting environment with people that you trust, all protecting against having a challenging experience. So this brings us to the clinical trial, and here's the design. There's an open label feasibility study in 20 patients. Initially we wanted to do a double-blind RCT, but it took us so long actually to get the drug that in the end we only had resources enough to do an open label trial, which was a point of some frustration, but also I feel like we kind of, in a way, pulled something out of the bag in terms of getting meaningful data and getting brain imaging data as well that could inspire further research. Anyway, the sample were treatment-resistant, major depressed patients defined as failure of at least 2 different medications within the current depressive episode. The average was 4.5. The top end was 11 different drugs. A couple of patients had 11 different drugs that hadn't worked for them. Virtually all of them had also tried talking therapies that hadn't worked for them. And we gave 2 doses of psilocybin a week apart, a low dose followed by quite a high dose, the kind of dose required to produce these very profound, mystical, spiritual type experiences. And we did before and after fMRI to look at brain activity and changes after the treatment. The post-treatment scan was done 1 day after the high dose experience. What did we see? Well, first of all, at baseline, 18 of the 20 met criteria for severe depression. All of them showed some degree of decrease a week after the high dose session, different magnitudes of decreases. If we look now at 3 weeks, half of them were in remission. Remember, this was a treatment-resistant sample. Many of the patients had had their depression for decades without relief, so quite remarkable that in half of them we could achieve remission at 3 weeks. If you look at these figures here are the effect sizes, so that's the magnitude of the change weighted by the variance in the changes, and the effect was actually maximal in terms of effect size at 5 weeks. Also at 5 weeks, none of the patients had gone on to any other treatment, so the data is quite clean in that respect. So pretty promising results. What we can't do with a trial like this, because it's open label, because it doesn't have a control condition, is say emphatically that this is all because of psilocybin. But to be honest with you, we'd never say that anyway, because we acknowledge that this is a composite treatment model that is much more than just a drug. But going forward, it is a challenge now to try and isolate these different factors. How much of this treatment effect is the psychological work? How much of it is the drug? And can you truly tease those two apart anyway? Or is there a kind of synergy between them? And actually, I think that that's likely to be the case. So promising, and the kind of thing that warrants a double-blind RCT and warrants questions like this. You know, if people are changing as they seem to be, here we're seeing lasting changes in people's depressions when they have had depression for quite a long time, but also other studies in healthy volunteers show, you know, changes in personality, changes in well-being, maybe changes in creative thinking after psychedelics. So what's accounting for this kind of thing? And to be honest with you, at this stage, in terms of what's accounting for it, in terms of changes in the brain, I don't really know, and I don't think anyone knows, and that's part of the kind of excitement really about where we are now, that we're just scratching the surface. But these data give us maybe some clues, at least in terms of the changes in depression. Granted, we're just scanning them one day after the treatment, so these are hardly long-term, looking at the long-term changes. But even so, what we found was quite surprising. Here we're looking at the integrity of the default mode network that I mentioned earlier, that network related to self-reflection, the sense of self, the ego, if you want. We can see the default mode network at baseline there, the top row, after the treatment, and then the subtraction, the difference between the two. You can see some red blotches in the bottom row. These are regions where there was more integrity or belongingness to the default mode network post-treatment relative to beforehand. What's curious about this finding is both that it related to the efficacy of the treatment, so those who were responding to the treatment at 5 weeks, this key endpoint, were those that showed this effect to the greater extent than those who didn't show a treatment response at 5 weeks. So it seems to relate to the effectiveness of the treatment. The other curious thing is that this is in completely the opposite direction to what we see when we look at the tripping brain. So when people are actually under the influence of psilocybin or any other psychedelic, not the next day, but while they're under the influence, hopefully you'll remember that we see a disintegration or a dissolution in this very same network. So what we're seeing here is something in the opposite direction, and it's relating to the treatment effect. So this was a curious finding and a bit of a kind of head scratcher at first. But then I saw that it related to other effective treatments for depression, like ECT, for example. And one of the things that's said about ECT is that afterwards people sometimes describe feeling a reset, that maybe, you know, their brain's kind of been, it's undergone this kind of acute onslaught in a way, and then afterwards it sort of reforms, but it reforms in a more ordered way than it was during their pathological state, during their depression, for example. And these are quotes from our patients in our trial, and they're referring to this reset effect. And this is without any priming. We didn't put this into their heads. It's just what they were saying to us. Here's a patient saying that the reset switch had been pressed so everything could run properly, thoughts could run more freely, all these networks could work again. Another one saying it's like when you defrag the hard drive on your computer. Another one saying my brain felt rebooted. I had the mental agility to overcome problems. Another thing that we saw is when we looked at a region of the brain, the parahippocampus, associated with memory, associated with imagination, associated with emotion, and asked this question of how its communication to the rest of the brain changed after the treatment. We found that the prefrontal cortex was less communicative with the parahippocampus after the treatment. And also this effect, again, related to the effectiveness of the treatment. So the more we saw this, the better people did with the treatment. What does this mean? Honestly, I don't know, but that's part of the fun of science, is to hypothesize and then test going forwards. And one of the hypotheses might relate to this aspect of the treatment model. And it's the experience of feeling emotionally reconnected after the experience. So perhaps something that runs contrary to what's sometimes associated with conventional antidepressant medications that might mute emotion and perhaps, decrease one's emotional range, whereas the opposite seems to be happening with psychedelics. People report feeling kind of an emotional release. And these are some accounts that speak to that. A patient here saying, I was weeping, tears were flowing out of me. It wasn't a painful crying, it was like turning on the taps, like a washing out. Another one saying, I saw negative patterns in my life where if something bad happens, I used to put it to the back of my mind. But now afterwards, after the treatment, I allowed myself to experience everything, even if it is sadness. Now I know how to deal with my feelings rather than repress them. So this principle of sitting with emotion, even painful emotion, rather than trying to push it away, seemed to be part of the mechanism by which this treatment was working. Related to this is the principle of insight, and actually we formally measured the level of insight that people reported after the experience, quite soon after the experience actually, and it was predictive of how well they did 5 weeks later. The higher the insight, the bigger the drops in depression. And this is something that I think we can test even better going forwards. And I feel that alongside the mystical experience, the spiritual experience, the experience of insight may be one of the key factors complementary to the mystical experience that relates to this particular treatment model, how it's different and perhaps how it's special. Following on with this idea of emotional reconnection, we also have some brain imaging data which speaks to it. And here we're looking at a key center in the brain that is involved in the processing of emotion. We're seeing that this region, the amygdala, is actually becoming more responsive to emotion after the treatment. And we saw, like with the other findings that I've shown, that the greater the augmentation or the increase of the amygdala responsiveness to emotion, the better people were doing afterwards. Now, what's curious about this effect is that it's actually quite different to what you see with SSRIs. What you see with SSRIs is that the amygdala response to emotion is muted, it's blunted. And so maybe this relates to the difference in these treatment models where SSRIs are working more to blunt emotion, to take the edge off of negative emotion, but perhaps also taking the edge off the possibility of experiencing full positive emotion, whereas psychedelics are more about a release of emotion. And these principles can feed into a kind of meta principle, if you want, and something that's emerged from our work and relates to other work that's been done. A number of different commentators, perhaps most notably Bruce Alexander, talking about addiction and this notion of dislocation underlying not just addiction but mental illness in general, a feeling of being kind of distanced from oneself and from other people and from the system, and how this can feed into addictions, for example. But we found it when interviewing our patients at 6 months after the treatment. Rosalind Watts, a colleague of mine, ran these interviews where she talked to all of the patients and asked very simple but important questions like, did this work for you? And if it did, how? And when she did that, she found that all of the patients who endorsed that the treatment had worked, which was the majority, said that, they referred to this particular principle of feeling connected after the treatment. That if they thought about their depression, it could be characterized by a sense of disconnection, analogous in many ways to Bruce Alexander's dislocation, a disconnection. And then after the treatment, they reported feeling reconnected, connected to themselves, to their emotions, and perhaps through that being a kind of cornerstone of the change, a reconnection to the self, feeling connected to others and to the world in general. So going forwards, we want to develop a new measure of this connectedness notion, with items in that relate to connecting to one's self, one's emotions, perhaps aspects of our minds that before we weren't fully conscious of, and also connecting to others, social connectedness, and connecting to the world in general, connecting to nature, for example. So that's what we're going to be doing. So I'm just coming to the end of the talk now, and what I have with this chart, it's a little busy, but it's just reiterating a way that we can think of psychedelics and how it's different to the leading antidepressant model in psychiatry, the SSRIs that can help but perhaps don't get to the root causes of people's suffering. Our sample was biased in that they were treatment resistant, so they tried conventional treatments and they hadn't worked for them, so they are likely going to, not have a particularly positive opinion of them. But this is a more moderate account, and I think it's quite a fair account perhaps about SSRIs. And here are patients saying that they did help, they cut the bottom off the peaks and the troughs, and that helped me cope. It didn't solve anything, but it helped me manage in the day-to-day. So I think these are more like pro-coping drugs, really, than drugs that can, or a treatment that can really engender lasting change and a true, remission where people are kind of not just coping, but really living again. Just to finish, some people might argue that's all you want, but it wasn't really dealing with the issue underlying the problem. And then, they said all sorts of positive things when asked to compare psilocybin to the SSRIs, just essentially saying that the psilocybin worked, whereas their past treatments didn't. So I've got 2 more slides to go, and this is where I take a slight kind of slight tangent, talking not just about mental illness, but also just the effects on psychedelics more generally. And so some interesting studies have shown that people do change after psychedelics, even healthy people, their personalities can change. A remarkable study by the Hopkins team showing that trait openness, one of the so-called big 5 domains of personality, is significantly increased over a year on from just a single experience with psilocybin. And personality shouldn't really change in adulthood. So this is a remarkable finding, that significant increases in a particular domain of personality occurring a year on, again, just from one experience, 5-6 hours. It's a truly remarkable finding. And then this key question which arose just kind of reflecting on this, that how does personality relate to political perspective, and does it? And then finding that it does, and there's this interesting, quite reliable relationship between openness and liberalism. And then just asking that curious question of whether perhaps there's something causal in this relationship. Is it the case that hippies take psychedelics, or maybe psychedelics make hippies? Who knows, I think it's a worthwhile question to ask. And so the way that we did this was, first of all, just to run a questionnaire study where we saw that there was a relationship between extent of psychedelic use and liberalism and nature-relatedness, which relates to how close we feel to nature and how we value it, and also a negative relationship with authoritarianism, so more psychedelic use, less authoritarianism. This has also been shown in another study in a larger sample, and most recently we tested it in our clinical trial. Towards the end of the trial, I shoehorned in a couple of measures looking at political perspective and nature-relatedness, just in a sample of 7, and yet giving these measures to people before and after the treatment, we saw increases in nature-relatedness and decreases in authoritarianism. So at this stage, not just a correlational relationship, but maybe something that's suggestive of something causal. So going forwards, it's important, I think, to see if this relationship stands up, to do more to test its causality, to look at its relationship with changes in brain function, and it does seem especially important to understand. Also, this question of, are all these changes necessarily good? You know, if you're a liberal, then you might think it's great that people become more liberal through taking psychedelics. But there are some important questions to ask here. If it's about people feeling more connected after psychedelics, then perhaps it's harder to argue that there could be anything, you know, bad about that. Particularly when it's been shown that there is a relationship between disconnection, in Bruce Alexander's terms, dislocation and mental illness. Also that certain mediating experiences can increase a sense of connectedness and also improve indices of mental health. It's been shown that, for example, experiences of awe or awesomeness in nature can relate to positive mental health. Similar mechanisms, maybe at least psychologically, with what happens with psychedelics, that people experience a kind of smallness of self in relation to the vastness of nature, and this has positive effects on their mental health, feeling connected to things. And others, again, you know, writing about connectedness being key and finding that it's key to recovery of mental health. And just to kind of to end on a caveat in a way that to understand these forces, perhaps, you know, forces of freedom versus order in terms of a balance. And these writers here, Adrian Bejan, who's a physicist, in a remarkable book, The Physics of Life, talking about the balance between freedom and order in nature, and how this is important. I'll just read these quotes because they perhaps speak for themselves. Without freedom to change, organization and evolution cannot happen. Organization keeps the changes observed in politics, history, sociology, biology, and geology from spinning out of control. So talking about order as being a kind of counterweight to pure freedom. Hierarchy occurs everywhere because it increases flow efficiency, benefiting everyone and everything. And then Jonathan Haidt here saying that the great conservative insight is that order is really hard to achieve. It's really precious and it's easy to lose. So I felt kind of motivated to put in this caveat slide because it's easy to get a little carried away with psychedelics sometimes and think that they're panaceas that can save the world. Maybe they can, but at least we should think about counterweights to the kind of changes that maybe we can see and engender with psychedelics. So just to end with one of my favorite quotes from Isaac Asimov. It said that he was the most prolific writer everywhere, of all time rather. Wrote a lot of sci-fi novels, and here he's saying that your assumptions are your windows on the world. Scrub them off every once in a while or the light won't come in. So just to thank those who've supported this research, the Alex Mosley Charitable Trust, Compass Pathways, doing amazing things at the moment, investing in a multi-site clinical trial looking at psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression in Europe and also in North America now. The Beckley Foundation, who've supported us from the very beginning, the team, David Nutt, my mentor, and thank you very much for your attention.
So now we have some time for questions. And we're just going to get things started. So if you can just line up at this microphone right here, where Bradley was standing. So graciously, if you could come up to the microphone if you have a question, and we'll start a line. And we will be moving in between some of the speakers from other cities, some of the guests from other cities. So yeah, let's start with our first question here in Toronto, just with your name, and try and keep the questions not too long. Just keep them brief and succinct, please. Thank you.
No worries. Sasha, thanks so much for coming. My question is, do you think that there is any merit to whoever is supporting the person going through the experience to also be on the same substance? When you alluded to other cultures and sacrament, some cultures believe that the shaman should be also in the same state as whoever needs the help.
Yeah.
And then there are others that believe, no, I will be the one that's under the sacrament and I will help you, or you'll be the one. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, and you can probably argue it both ways. I mean, it's hard to, make a negative judgment on a culture that's been using these medicines for thousands of years, and the wisdom that they will have developed through that. But equally, we do have a different culture in the West, and the possibility of having guides under the influence of psychedelics when they're caring for patients in a clinic is going to be quite challenging, and I think we have to be realistic about it. It's probably not a good idea, this is a different culture, and whether that's good or bad, it's the way it is, and we have to be realistic about what we can do in this culture. So I don't think it's going to happen. I also don't think there'll be a particularly strong lobby for it to happen. My personal view is that I think to have people in normal waking consciousness serving as kind of anchors for people when they're in, let's say the mystical state of consciousness, is a model that will work best really in this culture.
In our culture.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we're just going to be taking turns. So next we're actually going to be taking a question from Ottawa. So just pull them up over here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, how are you? Thanks for the talk. My question is, are there any negative side effects occurring to someone that's taking psilocybin and can take maybe other medication? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, good question. Did everyone hear that question? Yeah. Okay, are there any negative interactions between psilocybin and other maybe conventional treatments in psychiatry? Generally, with psilocybin, no. What's more likely is that the conventional treatment might have a muting effect on the psilocybin. So if people are on SSRIs, for example, they won't get the full experience with the psilocybin. So in our trial, we advise people to come off their medication, but there are caveats with that. That has to be carefully managed, and it's not always easy to come off one's medications. And so that might be a limitation of this treatment model, that's a requirement. So this can't really be a kind of add-on treatment. It's a kind of maybe even an either-or kind of situation. So generally it's more, there's no risk of serotonin syndrome, for example, with psilocybin and SSRIs, different to say maybe ayahuasca. Yeah.
Thank you.
Out of the patients that were in your study, how many suffer of any kind of panic or anxiety attack?
Whoa, far out. I kind of heard it.
Yeah. So how many cases of panic attack were there, and did it have any effect on the long-term effects of the treatment?
Yeah, there was certainly anxiety in quite a few cases. Panic attacks, no actual, clinically sort of diagnosable panic attacks. So, no kind of issues with people hyperventilating or, really struggling with their breathing and and really panicking and any sort of physiological effects around that. We didn't really see that, to be honest. I mean, people were quite well supported, the music was playing throughout, and so although there was intense anxiety, particularly during the come-up, we could guide people through that, you know, and reassurance, and that seemed to help. So no actual panic attacks.
But if they were, do you think that like a bad trip can have like negative effects on that? Or?
Yeah, so part of the data there around the challenging experiences, some people might use the term bad trip. We use challenging experiences because you kind of need to qualify a bad trip, because it's rare that a struggle or difficulty in a trip will continue throughout the whole of the trip and characterize the whole thing. If that does happen, then yeah, you know, we can call it a bad trip. And there is a bit of evidence that would associate that with certainly less positive outcomes, maybe negative outcomes. In our data, we saw more deflation of the positive outcomes. And challenging experience is a better term in my view, because if people can break through after a period of struggle, then there can be an emotional release, an emotional catharsis, and that period of struggle can actually be useful in some sense, in that they've worked through something and come out the other side and then feel a lightening because of that.
Thanks.
So next we're going to take a question from Atlanta. Atlanta, you can go right ahead whenever you're ready. Oh, they're muted. They're on the text.
Hi.
Hi. Go ahead.
We're wanting to know about what kind of research is happening in the United States and North America. If you can tell us about anything that's happening there.
Yeah, there's a lot that's happening. Johns Hopkins are doing a lot of research. Did everyone hear that? What research is going on in North America? Well, in the States, there's a lot. I don't think anything is truly started in Canada. Would that be fair? But hopefully soon. But in the States, psilocybin research at Johns Hopkins, now Yale are becoming interested. They're going to run a depression trial. NYU have been doing work in end-of-life anxiety in collaboration with Hopkins. They're also looking at addiction now, LSD for alcoholism. Anywhere else, probably, and I've missed them. Of course, there's the MDMA work. So yeah, quite a bit, and this, you know, is really taking off at the moment. So you can expect to see more and more, and so hopefully that does happen. Does that help?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay.
Hi, thanks for the talk again. I'm wondering if you know if there's any work or any hints at connection or similarity between psychedelic state and what's referred to as flow state, because
Yeah.
at least on the surface there seem.
Step a little closer to the mic.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there's a similarity between psychedelic state and flow state, and
Great.
because there seem to be at least subjective similarities in experiences, and looking at what people describe from flow state compared to, for instance, the interconnectedness chart you showed, the brain systems.
Yeah.
It seems like there might be something similar going on.
Yeah. So intuitively, are there similarities between flow states of being very much immersed in phenomena, feeling like one is very much in the moment, and in so being functioning optimally. These so-called flow states that have been described by Csikszentmihalyi, is that his name? He's written a classic book called Flow. Then others like Stephen Kotler, for example, has been writing about this. So a postdoc of mine is now working with Stephen Kotler to develop a formal measure of flow, and so we can apply that in different contexts and see, for example, whether low doses of psychedelics may increase the likelihood of people entering flow states. in which maybe they can, be entirely immersed in what they're doing, and in so doing, be able to operate maybe more optimally in some senses.
Great, thanks. I'll be excited to see that work.
Yeah,
progress.
sure. Yeah.